Sadjadpour. He is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment. He joined Carnegie after 4 years as the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group based in Washington in Tehran, where he conducted dozens of interviews with senior Iranian officials and hundreds with Iranian intellectuals, clerics, dissidents, paramilitaries, businessmen, students, activists, and youth, among others. He is a regular contributor to BBC TV and radio, CNN, NPR, PBS, and Al Jazeera. And he has appeared on the Today Show, Charlie Rose, Fox News Sunday, and the Colbert Report, among others. He contributes regularly to the publications such as The Economist, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The International Herald Tribune, and Foreign Policy. He is frequently called upon to brief U.S., EU, and Asian officials about Middle East affairs. He regularly testifies before Congress, has lectured at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford universities, and has been the recipient of numerous academic awards, including the Fulbright Scholarship. Lastly, in 2007, Sadjadpour was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. He is a board member of the Banu Foundation, an organization dedicated to assisting grassroots organizations that are empowering women worldwide. Let's give Mr. Sadjadpour a warm applause.
Thank you so much, Professor Rees, for that kind introduction, to Dr. Tucker for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. The title of today's talk is the Iran Saudi Rivalry. And I called up a friend of mine who's a West Point grad, who's a great scholar of the Middle East, Colonel Joel Rayburn. And I asked him, what is the best way to, what's kind of the best metaphor to think about the Iran-Saudi rivalry and in the context of the U.S. military rivalry between Army and Navy. And he said, well, it doesn't really work like that because there's three parts to the Iran-Saudi rivalry. It's ethnic, Persian versus Arab. It's sectarian, Shiite Iran versus Sunni Saudi Arabia, and it's geopolitical. And he said, in the United States, the Marines are the ones who are the Sunnis, and the Air Force are the Shiites, and so they're the upstarts. So I said, well, that doesn't help me a lot. And he had this very elaborate theory. But he did share with me a story, a joke, which I thought was pretty funny, which was a story about an Army guy and a Navy guy who are driving past one another in a rural country road. And as they're driving past each other, the Army guy's car skids on some mud and crashes into the Navy guy's car. And so they both get out of their car pretty angry. They see there's an Army bumper sticker on one car, Navy bumper sticker on the other car, and both their cars are totaled. And so they start to get into it, and things get pretty heated, and they're almost about to exchange blows. And then finally the Navy guy says, well, listen, let's just put this rivalry behind us. This is silly, we're brothers in arms. And I'll tell you what, I have a fifth of vodka in the back of my truck, and why don't we just relax a little bit? And so the Army guy says, that's a great idea. So the Navy guy pulls out the fifth of vodka with some shot glasses, and he says, you start first. So he gives him a shot, one shot. 5 minutes later, another shot. After half an hour, he'd given the Army guy about half a dozen shots of vodka. And the Army guy says, now it's your turn, why don't you start? He said, well, I'll wait. I just called the cops. I'll wait till after they come for mine. So the metaphor doesn't quite fit because neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia drink alcohol. So it doesn't really. But, there's an African proverb I think about when I think about the Iran-Saudi rivalry, and that is that when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. In the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the people who lose most are not really Iranians or citizens of Saudi Arabia, but really citizens of the Middle East. If you look at the bloodiest conflicts in today's Middle East, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, to a lesser extent, Lebanon, Bahrain, the Palestinian territories, they all have the element of the Iran-Saudi rivalry. Iran and Saudi Arabia are supporting opposing sides of that proxy war. And as I said, there's these three parts to it: ethnic, Arab, Saudi Arabia versus Persian, Iran, sectarian Sunni, Saudi Arabia versus Shiite Iran, and geopolitical. And the way the conflict is covered in the media these days is very much along sectarian lines, that these two countries basically have these ancient hatreds against one another, and they've been fighting for 1,000 years, and they're destined to fight for the next 1,000 years. But in reality, the conflict is deeply geopolitical. They have, as I said, these geopolitical differences, and during times when the region is in a state of conflict and crisis, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia heightens, and it kind of activates these. I describe it as the geopolitical conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's the hard conflict. The soft conflict is the Arab-Persian divide, the Sunni-Shiite divide, which during times of relative tranquility in the Middle East, they find a way to coexist. There's kind of a cold peace between them. But during times of geopolitical tumult in the Middle East, that's when when the soft conflict is really activated between the two sides. So, one way I think about this is think about kind of two big real estate developers in Washington, D.C. The two top real estate developers in Washington, D.C., and they're highly competitive. Each one wants to dominate the city. And they have totally different visions for what Washington, D.C. should look like. One has a very high-end aesthetic, wants to develop high-end condos, and the other has a very different perspective, wants to build low-end apartments. And so, when the city's real estate market is doing well, both of them can thrive and do well. But when things get very competitive, the rivalry between the two of them begins to accentuate. So think about it like that, and then think about if one of these real estate developers was an African-American Muslim, and the other guy was Jewish, a white guy. So instead of thinking about it in the context of these people having kind of competing aims for the Middle East, competing visions for the Middle East, instead we say, well, it's a black guy and a white guy, they've been fighting each other forever, or it's a Muslim or a Jew, they've been fighting each other forever. In reality, as I said, when the Middle East is at times a relative tranquility in the 1970s and the 1990s, there is this peaceful, I shouldn't say peace, it's kind of a cold modus vivendi between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the same way that France and Germany have rivalries in Europe, China and Japan have rivalries. These countries are always destined to be rivals, but they're not necessarily destined to be adversaries. Now, I think one interesting aspect, going back to the soft aspect of the rivalry, as I said, between Persians and Arabs, Sunnis and Shiites, is that there is this kind of chauvinism and superiority complex which both sides have towards the other. Iranians are Persian. Their history as a nation state goes back over 2,500 years. And there is this very strong Persian chauvinism, especially towards Gulf Arabs. They think that Saudi Arabia as a nation state is less than 100 years old. We're 2,500 years old, and there's this kind of Persian cultural chauvinism towards the Arabs, towards Gulf Arabs in particular. And likewise, in Saudi Arabia, it's the birthplace of Islam. Sunnis constitute about 80-85% of the Muslims in today's Middle East. And there is this kind of Sunni chauvinism towards the Shia. So each side has this kind of chauvinism against the other. And as I said, they're competing in these various conflicts which have become increasingly bloody. Now, the issue which has I think, exercised a lot of people in Washington, D.C. these days is the rise of the Islamic State, the rise of ISIS. And I'll just say a word about kind of the evolution of radicalism, the evolution of terrorism in the United States over the last several decades in the Middle East. And that is that, you know, your predecessors here at the Naval Academy, if they were listening to a lecture, say, in the 1970s on terrorism, would perhaps be told that the greatest terrorist organization in the world, again, this is in the 1970s, was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. At that time, it was considered in the West one of the greatest, if not the greatest terrorist organization in the world. And about a decade after the PLO, we saw the emergence of a group in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And Hezbollah eclipsed the PLO as the greatest terrorist organization, and the PLO, in comparison, looked moderate. And about a decade after Hezbollah came Al-Qaeda and the attacks of September 11th, and you know, Al-Qaeda became enemy number one, and Hezbollah, in comparison, looked somewhat moderate. And now, a decade after Al-Qaeda has come ISIS, which you know, there's a great line from Leon Wieseltier, who is a writer now with the Atlantic magazine, and he says, you know, there's no such thing as rock bottom in the Middle East. Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. So we didn't think, you know, we thought ISIS, Al-Qaeda was the worst of the worst, and now we have an organization, ISIS, which is far worse. And so the trend lines, as we look to the next decade and half decade, look conceivably like they could get even worse than ISIS. You know, an organization like ISIS, which has access to chemical weapons or biological weapons, or has the ability to print WMD using 3D printers. But I just want to throw that out there as a way to say that, you know, ISIS is an organization which poses a grave threat to both Iran and Saudi Arabia. So at the moment, there's efforts to see whether Iran and Saudi Arabia can put aside their various regional differences over the future of Syria, over the future of Iraq, over the future of Yemen, and see if they can cooperate hand in hand against ISIS. And one of the reasons why they haven't been able to do that is that they have two fundamentally different diagnoses about why ISIS came to be and who deserves blame for the rise of ISIS. From the vantage point of Saudi Arabia, they would argue that the rise of ISIS is attributable to the brutality of the Assad regime in Syria. You know, you have in Syria, as you probably know, a government run by the Alawite sect, the Assad Alawite sect, which represents approximately 15% of Syria's population, ruling over a population which has 75% Sunni inhabitants. And so that obviously has created great anger and disenfranchisement within the Sunni community. And you likewise had a similar, albeit much less brutal, dynamic in Iraq, in which you had not a Shiite minority, a Shiite majority government led by Nouri al-Maliki, which was not behaving as a leader of all Iraqis, but more of kind of a Shiite dictator who greatly disenfranchised the Iraq Sunni community. And so the Saudi argument is basically it's Iran's support for the Assad regime in Syria and the Maliki government in Iraq, which has fueled the rise of ISIS. And the Iranian retort is that no, the rise of ISIS and radical Sunni jihadism is a byproduct of Wahhabi ideology, kind of the very orthodox, conservative Sunni ideology of the Saudi government, and the funding of Gulf governments, particularly Saudi Arabia. So up until now, despite the fact that both Iran and Saudi Arabia have a common adversary in ISIS, they haven't managed to work together against ISIS. And I think what is interesting about the Iran-ISIS-Saudi triangle is that conventional wisdom, when you read the newspaper, will tell you that because of the fact that ISIS is Sunni, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, that ISIS is essentially a tactical ally or a pawn of Saudi Arabia, which is used to fight Iran and Iranian interests in the Middle East. I would argue, in reality, ISIS poses far more of an existential threat to Saudi Arabia than it does to Iran. So remember that, as I said, Iran is a majority Shiite country. About 90% of Iran's 79 million people are Shiite. So ISIS, which is about 35,000 Sunni radicals, will never pose an existential threat to Iran. It's never going to be able to take over the Iranian government. And on the contrary, I would argue that ISIS has actually served, to some extent, Iran's interests in the Middle East in a useful way, in that Iran has managed to significantly expand its influence in Iraq under the pretext of fighting against ISIS. And in comparison to ISIS, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who's used chemical weapons against women and children, who's complicit in the death of hundreds of thousands of Syrian citizens, and the displacement of half of Syria's 22 million population. Bashar al-Assad, in comparison to ISIS, increasingly looks like he's the king of Norway. And so from that perspective, it's also served Iran's interests. ISIS has served Iran's interests, in that Assad looks to many like he's the less bad alternative. So to some extent, as I said, ISIS doesn't pose an existential threat to Iran, and it's served Iran's tactical interests in the region. But the spread of ISIS's ideology and power and influence, I would argue, actually does pose an existential threat to Saudi Arabia, because the distance you have to travel from being kind of a Wahhabi, Sunni Wahhabi radical to becoming someone sympathetic to ISIS is not a terribly long distance. It's certainly not something which there's no Iranian Shiites who would become members of ISIS, but for Saudi Arabia that is a valid concern, that there's perhaps growing popular support for ISIS's ideology within Saudi Arabia. Especially, think about it, if your citizenry watches television on a daily basis and they see these brutal images of their Sunni Muslim brethren being killed in Syria or Iraq at the hands of Iran's clients. So ISIS's fight and their ideology has much more fertile ground in Saudi Arabia than it does in Iran. So again, I would argue that the spread of ISIS's ideology is much more of a threat to Saudi than to Iran. And in a way, I describe Iran as kind of the arsonist and the fire brigade in the fight against ISIS. Because on one hand, because of their actions in Syria and Iraq, they've fueled ISIS. On the other hand, they're on the front lines fighting against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. But let me talk about kind of switch to the implications for the United States, and I'll wrap up shortly after that so we can have more time for discussion. But I would argue that what's happening now and in today's Middle East is really a potentially a major kind of strategic break with the past 37 years since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So you probably know that prior to 1979, Iran was ruled by a monarchy, the Pahlavi monarchy, which was very much aligned with the United States, had a very close alliance with the United States for several decades. And after the 1979 revolution, you saw the replacement of a US-aligned Shah of Iran with a virulently anti-American cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who replaced the monarchy, 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran, with a theocracy. And so suddenly, Iran went from being one of America's top allies, not only in the Middle East, but in the world, to being one of its top adversaries. And U.S. policy since 1979, U.S. policy toward the Persian Gulf, I would argue, has been premised on two pillars. It's been cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the containment of Iran. And the U.S.-Saudi alliance, I would argue, has been based on there's been based on a few premises. One certainly has been energy cooperation, energy and security. So Saudi Arabia, as the country with the world's largest reserves of oil, that's something, that free flow of oil from Saudi Arabia is critical to the global economy. And the U.S., in order to ensure that free flow of oil from Saudi Arabia, has provided security to Saudi Arabia based on their common concerns about Iran. And in the last decade and a half, and especially in the last year or two, the premise of the U.S.-Saudi alliance has been called into question. First, over the last decade or so, the United States is experiencing its own indigenous energy bonanza with the advent of shale energy, which makes the United States less reliant on the free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. So that's one. Second is this, especially after September 11th, after Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, in the eyes of many foreign policy thinkers, national security thinkers, the threat of radical Sunni jihadism has arguably eclipsed the threat of radical Shia jihadism. And so Saudi Arabia, as the country in which, I think, 16 of the 19 hijackers emerged, is increasingly being questioned as a source of that radicalism. And I think increasingly many members of Congress, there was a speech recently from Senator Murphy from Delaware, highly critical of Saudi Arabia, and people citing Saudi Arabia as the most egregious example of U.S. interests and U.S. values being in conflict with one another. How can we, the United States, say we espouse and support democracy and gender equality and religious equality, and at the same time have an ally in Saudi Arabia which violates all of those principles? So I think there's increasing question marks about to what extent is Saudi Arabia a real ally of the United States. So you're having all that happening. At the same time, you're having this unprecedented détente between the United States and Iran. The Obama administration has made more effort than any previous U.S. administration since 1979 to try to change the tone and the context of the U.S.-Iran relationship. And the first major step was the nuclear deal, which was signed between the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, and Iran last July. And I think the hope within the administration is that this will help strengthen more moderate forces in Iran who are interested in a better relationship with the United States, and weaken these hardliners who are interested in a more revolutionary anti-American line. And so there is this hope and projections among some that Ian Bremmer, whom some of you know, is the head of a prominent political risk consultancy firm called the Eurasia Group. He's made the prediction that within 5 or 10 years, Iran will actually be a closer ally of the United States and Saudi Arabia. And I would argue that's probably unrealistic, despite all the concerns we talked about between the United States and Saudi Arabia feels deeply aggrieved and it feels abandoned by the United States. The reality is, at the end of the day, the Saudis really have no other strategic ally that can play the role that the United States plays for them, provides security for them, provides for them a cover against Iran. And Saudi Arabia wants to be allied with the United States. It wants to. It's not interested in an adversarial relationship with the United States. Whereas, despite the fact that you have in Iran, I would argue, the most pro-American population in the Middle East, and you have a president and a foreign minister, President Rouhani in Iran, Foreign Minister Zarif in Iran, who are interested in a more amicable relationship with the United States. What we call the deep state in Iran, the unelected establishment that really controls Iran's military forces, controls its judiciary, led by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, they're not yet interested in having an amicable relationship with the United States or cooperation with the United States. And their official slogan remains "Death to America." So as long as Saudi Arabia is interested in maintaining this alliance with the United States, and as I said, Iran's official line is to see America as the great Satan and to want this adversarial relationship with the United States. I think despite these predictions and projections which are being made that Iran will soon supplant Saudi Arabia as America's chief regional ally, I think that's pretty unlikely to happen. So why don't I actually stop there? And I was fairly brief. I'm happy to go into more detail on any questions you might have. Thank you.
Who's the first volunteer for a question? You raised your hand first. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sir, Iran Sadjadpour. My question is, in 2010 with the riots of the election, do you perceive it would take another riot, like another youth movement in Iran for the DJ, as you mentioned, to kind of start shifting their views towards the West?
It's a great question. So some of you probably remember that in 2009 there was this contested presidential election in Iran. Iran's previous president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, had run for re-election, and it appeared, what I say about elections in Iran is that they are unfree, unfair, and unpredictable. Despite the fact that they're rigged in advance, if all of you were presidential candidates in Iran, the way it works is there's this body called the Guardian Council, which essentially would interview all of you, and only those of you who are deemed sufficiently loyal to the principles of the Islamic Republic would be allowed to run. So in this case, in this room, none of you would be allowed to run. Usually about 90-95% of candidates are prohibited. So in 2009, you had massive popular protests against the re-election of Ahmadinejad because it appeared that not only was it rigged in advance, but they also rigged the ballot box. They didn't count the vote. And you had, I remember actually the specific date, June 15th, 2009, and there's actually a remarkable video you can see on YouTube. That day there was approximately 3 million people that were thought to have taken to the streets in Tehran for a silent protest. People didn't talk. It was a silent protest, and there's an incredible video in which someone gets atop a bridge in central Tehran, and he takes out his cell phone camera and he videos, and as far as the eye can see on a major street in Tehran, you could see people. And then he actually turned the other direction, turned the other way, and he put up his camera, and as far as the eye could see, in the other direction, there was a sea of people as well. And what ended up happening in 2009 is that you had these folks who were protesting, using civil disobedience, essentially, silent protests, and they were essentially crushed by the regime's, the Iranian government security forces. And I think one of the arguments I make about contemporary Iran compared to what happened in 1979 when the revolution happened was that, in 1979, Iranians experienced a revolution without democracy. And today, I would argue they want a democracy without a revolution. So people are interested in, I think they have kind of revolutionary ends. They would like to see more political freedoms, economic freedoms, social freedoms. But they're not willing to pursue revolutionary means, if you understand what I mean. And I think that sentiment has been especially accentuated in the aftermath of the failed Arab uprisings. Because imagine you're a young man living in Tehran, and you've been turning on your television set, watching the news the last several years, and you see the carnage taking place not that far from you in Syria. A few 100,000 people killed, 11 million people out of a population of 22 million people displaced. And then you see what's taking place on your borders in Iraq with, with ISIS just, tens of miles from your border beheading Shiites. Or in Yemen with, according to the UN, 80% of Yemeni citizens require urgent humanitarian assistance. So you begin to think to yourself, well, we may not be happy with the system that we live under, but if the alternative is chaos and anarchy, civil war, repression, well, better deal with the system we have rather than the alternatives. And again, I think that one of the distinguishing factors between, say, the opposition in Iran and the opposition in Syria is that the opposition in Iran is not willing to take up arms, not willing to go out and get killed or kill for the cause. And I think this is one of the paradoxes in today's Middle East. And in much of today's Middle East, you have kind of secular autocracies ruling over traditional religious societies. Syria is a very good example of that. Sisi's Egypt is another example of that. And Iran is arguably the unique exception in that you have actually a traditional religious regime ruling over a society which has become increasingly secularized. And I think it makes sense that after having lived under religious authoritarian government for 37 years now, in contrast to many Arabs who kind of romanticize about joining mosque and state, Iranians romanticize about separating mosque and state because they've had to live under that religious rulership for several decades. So the long answer, or short answer to your question is that I'm pretty hopeful about Iran's long-term future because I think that people have learned kind of a painful lesson. But at least in the near term, I mean over the next decade or so, I'm doubtful. I wouldn't expect that we're going to have popular protests in Iran which managed to change the disposition of the hardliners in Tehran. I think that's going to be a very gradual process. Thank you.
Do you foresee there being a difference between the way the Iranian military versus the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps interacts with the Saudis? And if so, do you think that would further exasperate the geopolitical divide between the two?
So that's also a very good question. And one of the chief complaints that countries like Saudi Arabia and frankly the United States have with Iran is that Iran's most powerful officials, meaning the supreme leader and Revolutionary Guard commanders, are inaccessible. So its most powerful officials are inaccessible, and its most accessible officials aren't powerful. So I'll give you a very good example. The foreign minister of Iran, you may have come across him, a guy called Javad Zarif. He studied at the University of Denver. He has a PhD from the University of Denver. He spent, perhaps more of his life living in the United States than he has in Iran. His children were born in the United States. He speaks perfect English. He comes often to New York. He travels often he was just at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And he's, at the moment, America's chief Iranian interlocutor. He and Secretary Kerry are in very frequent contact. And then you have a guy called Qasem Soleimani, who is the head of an elite wing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards called the Quds Force. And Soleimani doesn't travel to New York or to Davos or to Vienna. He hangs out in places like Tikrit and Ramadi and Damascus. And as far as I know, no U.S. official has ever met with him. He has a very different worldview, very different aims than Foreign Minister Zarif. Another good example of that divide is the divide between the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and President Rouhani. Supreme leader, what year were you guys born, most of you? So mostly in the 90s, right? So the supreme leader hasn't left Iran since 1989. He's not set foot outside of Iran since 1989, when the year he became supreme leader. So he's someone who doesn't meet with U.S. officials, is not going to meet with U.S. officials. And going back to the question of whether it might be possible for Iran's hardliners to change their views, as you get older, you'll see I'm sure you've noticed this with your parents, they're kind of increasingly set in their ways. And Ayatollah Khamenei is 76 years old, and he's been giving speeches, I would argue, twice a week for the last 27 years, attacking the United States, attacking Israel. His speeches are punctuated with cries of death to America from the crowd. So I think that at age 76, it's unlikely he's going to abandon everything he stood for his entire political life. And so Khamenei is the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Guards. And I would argue that he's perhaps the most brilliant Machiavellian leader in today's Middle East. Anyone knows? So Khamenei is the second longest serving autocrat in today's Middle East. As I said, he came to power in 1989, so he's been serving 27 years. Anyone know who is the longest serving autocrat in the Middle East? The longest. So, who said Sultan of Oman? Good answer, yeah, he is right. And it's not an obvious answer, but Sultan of Oman, if I'm not mistaken, has been leading for 46 years. Sultan Qaboos of Oman. And so after Sultan Qaboos of Oman, Khamenei is the second longest serving autocrat in today's Middle East. And the reason why I call him such a brilliant Machiavellian operator is this is someone who, I would argue, has gone to sleep every night. He's woken up every morning knowing that the greatest power in the world, the United States, would like to unseat him, would like that he no longer be ruling Iran, and much of his population feels the same way. Yet he's managed to survive and actually thrive in this environment. And he very cleverly uses both the sword of the Revolutionary Guards and Qasem Soleimani and the shield of Javad Zarif and the Iranian Foreign Ministry. So on one hand, he goes on the offensive using the Revolutionary Guards, trying to expand Iran's power and influence throughout the Middle East, in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, elsewhere. And at the same time, he's used the Iranian foreign ministry and the skills of the foreign minister to deflect pressure from Iran to get the sanctions against Iran removed, to get this nuclear deal signed. So he's been very effective, very clever. But I would argue that despite the fact that he oftentimes appears to play this balancer between the hardline forces and the more moderate forces in Iran, his loyalties and his worldview are much closer to those of the hardliners and the Revolutionary Guard. So this is another long way of saying that the complaint that the Saudis have is that they'll say, listen, our problem isn't with the Iranian foreign ministry or President Rouhani. So if we talk to President Rouhani or Foreign Minister Zarif, it doesn't really address our concerns. Our concerns are with what Iran is doing in Yemen, supporting the Houthis, what Iran is doing in Syria, what Iran is doing in Lebanon with Hezbollah, what Iran is doing in Iraq with Shia militias. And all of those activities are the domain of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, not the foreign ministry. And at the moment, I think the Saudis feel like, this is this old maxim which you oftentimes hear in the Middle East, that among two parties that are in conflict with one another, in particular, it's often said about the Israelis and Palestinians that, when one side is weak, it says, I'm weak. I can't compromise. I have to regain leverage before I compromise. And when it's strong, it says, I'm strong. Why do I need to compromise? And so that's why you oftentimes have this stasis. And right now, the Iranians feel very much in top in these different arenas I talked about. Iran is kind of like if you want to go back to the Army-Navy rivalry, I understand that Navy has defeated Army like the last 15 years in a row in football. And so Iran is kind of the Navy in this conflict, and in a lot of these regional proxy wars, it's had the upper hand against Saudi Arabia, and it feels like, why should it compromise? And the Saudis feel like they need to gain some leverage back in order to start negotiations with Iran.
I think we have time for one more question. Let's go with
Mr. Midshipmen, I was wondering, with the Honor Brigade and the other radical Shia militias fighting out of Iraq and loyal to Iran, as well as Hezbollah and the Assad regime, pretty steadfast in Syria, are the Saudis likely to put forth the conventional force to fight for that region, or are they depending on the Wahhabi jihadists like Al-Nusra to stake their interests?
Very good question. One thing that Iran has done very effectively, I tell people the same way that America has learned to outsource jobs to China and India, Iran has become very effective at outsourcing radicalism and outsourcing kind of militias. So if you look at these areas where we've talked about, those fighting on Iran's behalf are usually not Iranians. They have Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories, sometimes Hamas, the Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, Houthis in Yemen, these Shia militias we talked about in Iraq. And Saudi Arabia has been far less effective at projecting power like that. And those forces that Saudi Arabia has sometimes supported, some of these Sunni groups, it's oftentimes difficult to discern whether that support comes actually from the Saudi government or it comes from Saudi private citizens, and they've never managed to organize anything remotely close to Hezbollah in Lebanon, an effective, cohesive fighting force with a very kind of clear ideology and a clear worldview. So I don't see any signs. You see Saudi Arabia trying to throw money at different groups, particularly in Syria. But I haven't seen any signs that Saudi Arabia is managing to really organize an effective fighting force that could compete with Hezbollah or compete with Shia militias in Iraq. And when they do try to decisively intervene in a conflict, and Yemen is the most recent example of that, it's largely using air power rather than ground forces. And you guys know this much better than I do. It's air power which you could argue has done as much, if not more, damage than it has done good, in that it's destroyed a lot of Yemen's infrastructure. It's destroyed. It's killed many civilians, but it hasn't been terribly effective at weakening Iran's interests in Yemen or curtailing radicalism. You could argue, in fact, it's provided even more fertile ground for radicalism. So that's something which Saudi Arabia has never managed to compete with Iran. In fact, they have, as I mentioned, they for many years just kind of outsourced their security to the United States, and so what's starting to change in this U.S.-Iran-Saudi dynamic is that the Saudis increasingly feel like America is either tired of the Middle East, that wants to pivot to Asia, or it's no longer the paradigm of the last 3.5 decades, which, as I mentioned earlier, was cooperation with Saudi Arabia and containment of Iran, has now shifted. America is now actually seeking cooperation with Iran. So they feel, for a variety of reasons, that they need to be more proactive and assertive in pursuing their own regional interests and security interests. And that's why you've seen this intervention in Yemen. And I've spoken to folks on the Hill, advisors to members of Congress, who've said to me that, for years we would tell the Saudis that you guys have to stop relying on the United States. You have to start taking care of your own security and not relying 100% on us. And the problem is they're not doing that, and they're doing that arguably to the detriment of U.S. interests, detriment of their own interests, and detriment of Yemeni interests. But it's tough for us to tell them not to do it, just because for years we've told them to be more proactive, and when they finally do that, it's tough for us to tell them not to. So I think that we will see in the next year or two, 5 years, whether this trend, which is kind of cooperation between Tehran and Washington and distancing between Riyadh and Washington, is this just kind of a temporary blip, and it will soon revert back to status quo ante, which was, as I said, cooperation with Saudi Arabia, containment of Iran? Or is this a sign of things to come? And I think the two major determining factors in that, or I should say the three major determining factors, will be who is the next president of the United States, who is the next supreme leader of Iran, and who is the next king of Saudi Arabia. We know for a fact that next year there will be a different president in the United States, and the king of Saudi Arabia is close to 80 years old. He probably doesn't have a long future ahead of him. There's a major joust for power between two crown princes that will have huge implications about the future of Saudi Arabia. And likewise in Iran, the supreme leader of Iran is 76 years old. Mullahs tend to have long lifespans, so it's not clear how much longer he'll be around. But we could be looking at a very different dynamic a decade from now. But I would argue that absent a change of leadership in Iran, at a minimum, we're not going to see U.S.-Iran rapprochement anytime soon. And I'll leave you with this: absent some de-escalation in these regional conflicts, we're not going to see kind of peaceful modus vivendi between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I do want to emphasize that point, which is there's kind of two ways to think about the Iran-Saudi rivalry. It's that Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting with one another, and their bilateral fight is spreading throughout the Middle East, and it's exacerbating these crises in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. Or it's that these regional conflicts and civil wars, which began for reasons of their own, for similar reasons that people rose up in Tunisia or rose up in Egypt against corruption, injustice, or oppression, disenfranchisement. Each of these conflicts in the Middle East had that dynamic to some extent in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. Those regional conflicts are the conflicts which actually exacerbate the Iran-Saudi rivalry and widen the mistrust and animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which in turn further aggravates the regional conflicts. I'm in the second category. I believe that it's not, as I said, I think when the region is not in a state of crisis, Iran and Saudi Arabia have kind of a cold peace between them, but it's when the region is in a state of crisis that it aggravates their bilateral relationship. So.
Let's thank Mr. Sadjadpour.
You can't the Naval Academy without the obligatory image of your posters now.